The story continues. God's story continues. The upper story that He wanted to share with all humanity in the creation. And as we know, that didn't end up well. But God didn't give up His mission, His dream of sharing His upper story with the now lower story that is in disarray. He builds a nation through an unlikely candidate, Abraham. We looked at that last week. Today, we get to see how his upper story comes into the very low story of a man named Joseph. A young man, in fact, about 17 years old. As I got to thinking about this, I was just wondering what writing our own story often gets us, or even what it's like to write our own story is what we often try to do. And I even Googled that. I put in, write your own story. And one of the things that came up is choose your own adventure series. Have you ever heard of that? Anybody ever heard of choose your own adventure series? 250 million copies were sold. They're a children's book where you can read to a certain page and then you get to choose the adventure that you're going to go on. And I'd never heard of it. It came after kind of my kids, and I was thinking, what a cool thing. And then I also got thinking, no wonder it's a children's series, because as adults, we've come to learn that we often don't get to choose our own adventure, do we? We don't get to write our own story. Oh, it doesn't mean we don't try. And oftentimes we maybe try too much. And because of that, we mess things up. There's things we choose to do that do give direction to our lives, and not always in the most positive direction. Sometimes, however, we make choices that do. But even in the best of scenarios, even in the best of trying to write our series, our adventure, things happen. And it never seems to, as we see in our introductory statement here. And if you'd bring that up, Ted. Next slide, please. We often start out thinking that we're going to write our own story, but it never seems to turn out quite like we intend, does it? As we get into our story today, we learn something very quickly, and it's our first takeaway that I want to share with you on your outline there. Joseph grew up in and I wanted to say totally dysfunctional family. Now talk about your dysfunction. And I want to go to that lesson where it starts out in chapter 37, because it now goes from chapter 37 to the end of book of Genesis for this part of God's story. And you can just see dysfunction all over this. It actually says the account about Jacob, and then boom, the next word is Joseph. Because this kind of summarizes how dysfunctional Jacob had become. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. See any problems with that? Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Man, when you talk about being raised in a dysfunctional situation, think of that. Number one, three stepmothers in the same household. Can you imagine what that was like for Joseph? But then Joseph was really set up poorly by his father. If his father really loved him, he could have helped that situation a whole lot better than he did, right? But he just made it worse, didn't he? We've learned that when we've played favorites or when we've been favored. And it was awkward for us because somebody favored us. I remember at seminary, Professor Herber, actually the one who was the editor of the Concordia Study Bible, we called him Sarge Herber. He had a crew cut, and he just barked orders at you. And he was our Greek professor. And we got in there for Greek class, and he says, "You girls all have the same problem. You all signed up for Greek, and you paid for Greek, but I'm going to throw the English in for free." But then he started calling on people, and it would be Bischoff. That was one of the guy's names. And he'd call your name, and he'd just accent. And then he would get to me, and he'd go, "Wade, would you?" And everybody's like, "Wade?" He calls him by his first name. I think he thought Wade was my last name. But then he never was rough with it. He was gentle. And man, I don't know if he did it on purpose, but the guy started razzing me the whole semester. And I know he didn't like me more than the rest because my grade was probably about as bad as it could get in the Greek class. But the bottom line was I was uncomfortable. We can be in that. Favoritism never turns out good for us or for the one we're favoring. And it didn't for Joseph. Joseph he was set up. And you can imagine kind of how he was getting. He walked around with the robe. He was told by Dad, "Hey, go out, spy on your brothers, and bring me a report." Now, how many kids really need a lot of encouragement to be tattletales? We've all dealt with that, right? And the way we've tried to deal with now, if you come and tell on your brother or sister because you're really trying to help them, that's one thing. But if you come just to get them in trouble, guess what? You're going to get the same punishment they're going to get. Ooh. Now, did that always work for us? It's still a hard thing to deal with. But this was the opposite. He was sending them out there and saying, "You go find the dirt on them, and then you bring it to me." Can you imagine why these guys hated him so much? The dysfunction in this family was running rampant. He loved them not just because it was in his old age, but it was with the wife he loved more than the others. Can you imagine the favoritism in that and what it did in the home? Rachel was his favorite. And so you can see here that this was a difficult situation for Joseph, but Joseph didn't handle it well, and we begin to see Joseph has a special gift from God. And it says dreamer here. He actually has a dream about his position. But before he gets these dreams, he must also have the gift of interpretation, because the dreams were about these sheaves of wheat, and whether he just assumed, but that's what it meant, that these sheaves were going to bow down to him were his brothers, or God gave him the interpretation too, which is probably the case. It's how he dealt with it. By the way, if you ever get a dream about somebody they're not going to like, I wouldn't share it with them. Just wait and see what God does with it. But no, he goes and tells his brother. Then he has another dream about the sun, moon, and the stars, number of his brothers bowing down to him, and he actually gets rebuke from his father. Why would his father rebuke him if he humbly went to him and said, "Dad, I had this dream, and this is what this concerns me." But instead he draws rebuke from his dad. What do you think? See, it's often seen that he was very arrogant about these dreams. And do you think we're going to bow down to you? Well, as we know, it comes out they do. But his attitude is weighed that you don't see humility in this, and it just creates more and more problems, not only with the brothers, now with Dad. And yet Dad still loves him more than the rest. And so the brothers end up doing something to him that he shouldn't. In Genesis 37, verse 19, it says, "Here comes the dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns." And they say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Now Reuben comes into the scene and he goes to bat for him. He says, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in the cistern because he's got a plan. He's going to sneak him out of there, get him home to his dad. But in the meantime, unbeknownst to Reuben, the brothers hatch a plan. In fact, Judah speaks up. And he sees a caravan coming, and he says, by the way, from the Ishmaelites, isn't that poetic justice as far as Ishmael and Hagar from last week? And now this caravan's coming, and Joseph, Judah's idea, let's sell him, let's get something out of this. And they strip him of his robe. And so you guys don't have to see me model my special robe anymore. They take this robe off, and they do something very prophetic. They take the blood of a wild beast, of an animal, and they put it on the robe. And they take it to the father, and they lay it at his feet, and they tell him, Joseph has died. And for all intents and purposes, Joseph was dead to Jacob, and it grieved Jacob terribly. I wonder if even part of his grief was that he put him in this position. And we see here in verse 26. Verse 26, it says, Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood?" And you think of that covering of the blood. In Revelation, you get toward the end of the Bible and you see, as I mentioned with the kids earlier, that these are they who have come out of the great tribulation, those that are before the Lamb. And they have washed their robes in what? The blood of the Lamb. You see, the sacrifice of blood continues through from when he provided clothing for them, spilled the blood of an animal so that they could be cared for and provided for. God provides. They use that spilling of blood in this terrible way in death, but God always used the spilling of blood in a good way to save life. And it took death, the death of the Lamb of God, to save the lives of all of us. And so you see in chapter 39, as you go to that, chapter 39, you have the dreamer. When he said there he's a dreamer, he had the two different dreams. And it says here in 39 verses 9 and 10, no one is greater in this house, and this is Potiphar, than Potiphar's house, because he was sold into slavery. He was sold to the captain of the guard. And this is where the story really kind of takes a Desperate Housewives kind of turn, if you could look at it that way. And Potiphar's wife, saw Joseph was a pretty handsome guy, always around the house maybe, I don't know. The thing I wonder is Potiphar maybe his sin in all this is he could have been home more taking care of his wife instead out fishing. Because now he had a lot of time on his hands, right? He didn't concern himself about his household because God had been in favor with Joseph in a way that raised him up in Potiphar's eyes, and he didn't even worry about anything in regard to his household. And Joseph sees that. No one is greater in the house than I am. Now, is this him being arrogant? No. Here's what he says, my master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? You see who he knows he's sinning against? That's why he has had a change of heart. He's now humble. Though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. And that's when she set her trap. Servants weren't in the house. That would have been strange. She probably did something about that. He comes in. She grabs him and says, "You got to take me to bed." He rips away from her, leaves his coat, and he goes. And there is truly no scorn like a woman's scorn. Because the fury comes out. She has been rejected, she's hurt, and she takes it out on him. And so takeaway number 2. What we see in this lower story is a common thing that we often see in our lives. Maybe in our own life personally we've struggled with this, but that we often respond to disappointment by actually justifying our bad behavior. I can see the brothers as they got together and they talked. He's getting what he deserves. Okay, maybe he doesn't deserve to die, but being sold off, God bless him. And God did bless him. Potiphar's wife may have justified what she was doing. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe she was spoiled. I don't know. But when we're in our life, a lot of times we'll make up excuses, and it goes back to the garden, doesn't it? This woman you gave me, Lord, she's the one. And so I took and ate. How many times say, I wouldn't have done that if this chain of events happened and it came out. I had to do it because it's a common thread in the lower story and how we often make decisions. And we make our share of bad decisions. And we affect not only our lives, but the lives of others. And others affect our lives oftentimes. And that's when we start saying, why did God let this happen? Because God has allowed all of us still in our free will to make choices, yes, that still hurt people. But it doesn't mean He stopped working in it. Just as He didn't stop working in this. In 39 verses 19 and 20 we see that. And if we turn to that page, it says, when his master heard the story and his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Now some interpret this that he was the captain of the guard, and because of that, he would have been in a position to actually torture and kill Joseph for this. And it almost sounds like that he had mercy on him by just putting him in prison. But it says here very clearly, his anger burned. And so he in no way was taking mercy on Joseph. It says Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And they were often confined there until their punishment was either exacted or was over. Now again, what we see here, and this is in takeaway number 3, the answer to the question, where is God in the disappointment? Where is God in the disappointment? Well, exactly where is He in this disappointment that we're seeing in this lower story of Joseph is in verse 2, first of all, and we see it in 2 actual places, verse 2 and verse 23. And it says clearly, where was God? Where was He? He was with him. The Lord was with him the whole time. The Lord never left him. Now, you can imagine how devastated and broken Joseph was when he was sold by his brother. He didn't get to grow up in a house of love like many of our children do today. He grew up in a house full of hatred toward him. They couldn't stand him. To be rejected to the point where you thought worthless enough to hear him saying, let's just kill him and throw him in here. But then to sell him to somebody, which again is prophetic. What did Jesus' life cost? 30 pieces of silver. They sold him into slavery. he goes into that slavery, and then God blesses him in that. Joseph is really changing. It was a lot of work to do what he did, but God gave him the abilities. And he started to see God was blessing him. He not only had won over Potiphar, now he wins over the jailer, the head jailer, the one that was in charge. And he turns everything over to Joseph. And Joseph works hard. He cares for the inmates. And he gets more dreams that are brought to him. And he has the ability to interpret these dreams for two different people. The first one, the baker comes out, not the baker, the cupbearer comes out wonderful. And so the baker goes, well, I'll tell him my dream. Didn't come out so good. But can you see the whole thing unfolding? Well, he got him close to Egypt by having him sold to Potiphar. He gets him close to the Pharaoh by having him put in prison with the Pharaoh's people. He gives him the gift to be able to interpret dreams. And the cupbearer ends up going back, forgets all about him. Until now, Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh has a dream. It's a dream that is just hard for him to understand what's going to happen here. And the cupbearer, and he's got all his people coming in trying to interpret this, and nobody's coming up with anything. And the cupbearer remembers Joseph. He goes, I know a guy. And so he has him brought. And I love how he responds to this. Genesis 41, verse 16. It says, I cannot do it. Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. In other words, I can't interpret your dream. I can't tell you what that all means, but I know someone who does. Do you see how humble he is here? Do you see how he bows down before the Lord, gives God all the glory, and he says, God can answer any of your questions. God can take care of what you need. And he does it again later on, if you turn to verses 38 to 41. And it says, so Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you. See who's getting the glory here? There is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace and all my people. And they are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow. Fourth takeaway. God still provides. Joseph now humbled. Joseph in this position. And God provides in a great way. And the dream that he had was about 7 good years, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph in charge, has them store up everything. And then, as we know, Joseph's family gets hungry. You've been able to read that this week. That's an incredible story. It's a process. They have to go down. Joseph recognizes them, but he doesn't say anything. Not right away. And he continues to bless them. The vision he sees the first time, the vision of the wheat bowing down is there. The vision of the stars, the sun, and the moon comes later, but it all comes true. Not maybe in the braggadocious way he first thought, when it was just going to happen, it was going to become a worldly thing, and then it turns out to be this plan of God to take care of his family during a very severe famine. But what you see here in chapter 45, verses 1 to 5, it just says that Joseph could no longer control himself in front of his brothers before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified of his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead to you. The next passage is all about what happens later after they go through the process of bringing the family down. By the way, you see the fulfillment of God's promises all taking place. They come down to Egypt, the whole family. They're given the best land, the land of Goshen, the most fertile land. They're blessed. They start out, there's 70 plus people. And in 400 years or so, they're going to become a nation of millions. The descendants are starting to multiply. The blessing. And then here's what, you often hear of collateral damage in wars and things. In God's story, when His upper story is in the lower story, you have collateral blessings. Do you remember His promise to Abraham that your descendant, you're not only going to have descendants in the land, you're going to become a blessing to the nations. And it's already happening right here in Egypt. God blesses Egypt in a great way through His people. Wherever they're at, even when it's not fair, even when decisions have been made in the most ugly ways of hatred, God is still there. The Romans 8 passage that we have for our conclusion here is how God still works for good for those who love Him. God still works for good in every situation, no matter what happens. There's incidental happenings in all of our lives. Some of those incidences might come because of ugly decisions that we make and the sin that we carry. Some of those incidences are thrust upon us by others. And we can, in faith, know that we're not alone. Just like with Joseph, God is with us. And that's where, God can work His greatest miracles, is in our worst of times. In those times where we start to want to ask, why is this happening? And yet, God can say, I'm not going to give you that answer, but I'm going to let you know what I'm going to do with it. And He works that out in His lives. That's what you and I have the privilege to be in, that story of God, the upper story that comes down in His Son and lives with us today in a special way. Today, as we close our service, we're going to stand and we're going to confess. We're going to confess this God that walks with us even when it's difficult for us. Please stand.